Is Final Fantasy IV a timeless classic? Well, it was the first Final Fantasy released on the Super Nintendo, and what we can say is it certainly tried to create a memorable cast of characters based upon the various jobs from previous entries like Dragoon, Monk, Bard, and more. It also made a change to the battle system that would be used for many entries into the future, including even more recent entries like Final Fantasy VII Remake, which have taken inspiration from it, the ATB or Active Time Battle System. It's a game about light versus darkness. Darkness! Mind control inception. The cosmos. Sexy dancing. Biblical references. And we can't forget all of the...
spinning.
いちいちくるくる回すんですよ。
時田さんが回ってたね。
だからこれ
回す
こっちはちょっとストーリーとしては重くしたかった、
はい
だから、途中回転禁止令出しました僕は。
回転禁止令出しました僕は。
This is my series called Rediscover Final Fantasy, where I intend to play every Final Fantasy game, and I mean every Final Fantasy game, including all the spin-offs in order of their release. I'll be playing the good ones, the bad ones, the ones I've played before, and the ones I haven't. There are many versions of Final Fantasy IV, maybe even too many. I personally have played and beaten the PS1 version as part of Final Fantasy Chronicles and the 3D remake on the Nintendo DS. However, for this video, I played through the entirety of the Pixel Remaster version and even platinumed it, which makes it my third time playing through the entirety of the game. So the question is, how does this version stack up against the other versions that I've played? This is also where many Final Fantasy fans got their start 33 years ago and still hold this game near and dear to their heart, but are they blinded by nostalgia goggles? Or is there something to this game that still holds up in 2024? Final Fantasy IV begins on an airship starring the main character Cecil, captain of the Red Wings, who resembles a certain job that you had to use in Final Fantasy III. Remember the dungeon late in the game where if you attacked enemies they would multiply, so you had to use a particular weapon that only a certain job could do? No? Oh, that's right. If you played the game here in the West, you wouldn't have thought that because, well, Final Fantasy III didn't exist. Anyway, the job is Dark Knight. It seems that he's been tasked with obtaining the water crystal at Mysidia. However, he and his crew feel it's a bit unnecessary to kill innocent people in order to obtain it. Despite this, he does the deed and forks it over to the King of Baron. However, that doesn't stop him from questioning the king's motives. This gets him into trouble and is then relieved of his command of the Red Wings and is instead tasked with delivering a bomb ring to the village of Mist. Cecil's friend Kain, a dragoon, begs the king to reconsider, but the king refuses to listen and instead orders Kain to join Cecil on his mission. When they arrive at Mist Village, the bomb ring suddenly activates and sets the town ablaze without either of their consent. It turns out that the village of Mist is filled with summoners, and they essentially wipe them all out, except for a young girl named Rydia, making her the last surviving summoner. This is actually very reminiscent of the opening scene to Final Fantasy II, where the Emperor uses bombs to burn down cities. And can I just say that this idea of a pre-programmed magic spell encoded into the bomb ring is a rather interesting idea. This is the only instance of this being used in the game, but imagine an empire manufacturing these and weaponizing them for destruction. Might be a cool idea if they ever remake this game, which more on that later. But anyway, out of distrust, Rydia summons Titan to protect herself, which separates Cecil from his companion Kain. This is essentially where your adventure begins. Final Fantasy IV is a game where you travel the world across many towns and dungeons, adding new party members and losing even more. Really, this is a huge focus of this game. Most of the Final Fantasy entries prior, you had a set party of 4, except in Final Fantasy II. But even in that game, you had a set party of 3, but then you would gain an additional guest party member until pretty close to the end when Leon slides into that permanent 4th slot. It feels like they just ran a slot machine to determine who was going to be in your party in this game. To be fair, I don't think it's actually a bad thing. If it's your first playthrough, it really adds a lot of twists and turns to the story, which makes you want to know what's going to happen next. But this party slot machine isn't just used to add twists and turns to the story, but also the gameplay. And this sort of goes back to something I said about Final Fantasy III, which is that a lot of the games Sakaguchi was involved with have this sort of energy to them, and Final Fantasy IV continues this trend. The game constantly keeps you on your toes when they switch up your party members. The whole game you're being thrown to the wall and have to learn how to best utilize this new crew you've been handed. Hell, even the main character isn't safe, as he changes from Dark Knight to Paladin, completely changing his abilities and equipment. And that's just one of the aspects that I think puts this game above its predecessors, is that it does a great job of curating its design to the characters and their abilities. It takes that element of Final Fantasy III with its dungeon design, where the game would often demand you choose certain jobs to get through certain dungeons, but streamlines it in a more curated fashion. This constant readjustment based on new party members keeps you on your toes. And speaking of keeping on your toes, the battle system itself does a good job of that. That's due to a new addition to the series. Instead of selecting all your commands and then the game rank ordering each unit's turn based on agility, the turns happen in real time, indicated by this little bar right here. Which, if you've played the original version of the game, is, well, absent. But they've added it in pretty much every other version of the game, including this Pixel Remaster version. Once the bar fills up, you can now command that character. Any action will immediately enter the turn queue. This also means that you're not forced to take action right away. On occasion, you may want to wait for a different character to take action first, and you can alternate between active characters at the press of the triangle button if you're playing on PlayStation. Why might you do this, you ask? Well, sometimes a character will die. If you revive them with a Phoenix Down, let's say, they'll have very little HP. If they have very little HP, and then an enemy's turn comes, they may attack the character you just revived, killing them all over again. In fact, they will do this. Because of course they will. If you're a dumbass like I am sometimes, you'll continue to revive characters, and then they will keep dying immediately after before you get to heal them over and over again until you remember that you're being a dumbass, and then you decide to just wait until 2 characters already have an active command waiting, so you can have one character revive them with a Phoenix Down, and another to heal them with a cure spell or potion right after, before the enemy gets their turn and puts your effort to shame. Now, when I first started playing this game, I actually was kind of missing Final Fantasy III a bit. It felt like a downgrade to not have as much customization of my characters, and you don't really see the benefits of the ATB system, as you only have a couple of characters to command, and mostly all you do is attack. However, the further into the game I got, the more I started to remember why I used to love the ATB system. It really does have this frantic feel to it, especially during boss battles. They often have patterns that you have to learn. They usually involve some form of punishment if struck with the wrong type of attack, or striking at the wrong time, such as a powerful counterattack, which is an idea that, while it can work in a traditional turn-based system, it works much better as a mechanic in an active time battle system. And the addition of that 5th party member slot, in my opinion, makes up for the lack of customization or ability to change jobs. Having to manage 5 characters in a more real-time battle system certainly keeps you busy. The ATB wasn't the only thing that Final Fantasy IV introduced for the first time. It introduced a concept that maybe isn't so much a concept, a mechanic, or feature, but rather a feeling that I think a lot of later Final Fantasy games also do very well, and that's this idea of creating a bond with the characters and story through gameplay, sometimes even through unbalanced mechanics, which is something a lot of modern games, I feel, lack. It's always seen as a bad thing whenever a game is unbalanced, and sure, it certainly can be a problem, especially in an online multiplayer game. You probably don't want things to be unbalanced. But sometimes it's okay to create unbalanced characters in a single-player game, and I think Final Fantasy IV does this very effectively. Edward, the spoony bard, doesn't really have a lot to give. In fact, the game literally gives you a command for him to hide during battle, basically making him useless at times. It almost feels as if he's a burden. Now, depending on your perspective, this could be seen as a negative thing, and most of you probably agree with that sentiment, but it's hard to argue that it doesn't at least give him character. Tellah is another example. He starts off overpowered with tons of magic spells and seems like he has pretty strong stats, but the further you get into the game, the more you start to realize he doesn't level up much, and even when he does, he doesn't really get much stronger than he was before. That iconic, unwavering 90 NP he has is something that I haven't forgotten, even though it's been like 15 years since I last played this game. He's an old dude, and the way his stat progression works reflects this. It's almost as if he's aging out the further into the game you get, that it feels like it's his time to go when he actually dies in the story. And that's the other connection that you feel when playing these games, is that when a character leaves the party, you actually feel the loss. They weren't just characters in the story, they were active members of your party that you used. You feel the void left in the party as soon as you start fighting battles again because they're gone. And conversely, you forget how much you miss them sometimes when they come back, making their return feel all the more triumphant. This is something that more modern games have trouble providing because they've become more action-focused. Even if there are party members, it sometimes doesn't hit in the same way when a character is gone, simply because you often just play as one character anyway. So it's even more imperative that they really deliver on the narrative and the story so that you feel sad when they depart and joy when they return. This is how some of these older command-based games can achieve some of the same or even greater emotional connection with the story despite not having as much narrative depth. And while we're on that subject, let's talk about the story of Final Fantasy IV. For a game released in 1991, the narrative was impressive. Not many games prior to Final Fantasy IV had as many twists and turns, and definitely not many Final Fantasy games had. This game is about good versus evil, light versus darkness. Cecil himself starts out as a Dark Knight, but early on in the game, he undergoes a trial to cast away his old self who participated in the tyranny of the Kingdom of Baron, robbing other nations of their crystals. His adventure changes to that of protecting the crystals. Throughout most of the game, he fails in his attempts to save the crystals, and instead the lead villain, Golbez, who is later revealed to be Cecil's brother, collects them all, both the crystals of light and the crystals of darkness. But the question is, why? Well, to get to the moon, of course. Duh. By bringing all the crystals to the Tower of Babel, he will be able to bridge the connection to the moon, which, the Tower of Babel is an interesting name. It's actually a reference to a biblical story where humans defied God by building this enormous tower that kept going for an infinity, needlessly exceeding any reasonable height. God punishes them by mixing up the people's languages, making it difficult for them to communicate, causing confusion, and eventually cease building the tower. It's meant to be a story that teaches a lesson about pride. Now, there are many parallels between the biblical story and that of the Tower of Babel from Final Fantasy IV, but one could create an entire video on it, so that's as far as I'll go here. But the next question is, why go to the moon? Well, this is where plays a role. You see, early on in Final Fantasy IV, your good pal Kain betrays you, but you actually find out that he's being controlled by Golbez. But then later in the game, you find out that Golbez is actually being controlled by a Lunarian named Zemus. So it's mind control of mind control of mind control. How is Zemus able to control his mind? Well, it comes back to the theme of light versus darkness. You see, if there's some darkness within you, then Zemus can harness that to control you. Golbez apparently had some darkness within him, and so he was able to be possessed by Zemus. How did Golbez come to have darkness within him? Well, in the original game they never really explained this, but they kind of do in the DS, or 3D remake. And that brings me to talk about the 3D remake. But first, I should mention that I've played a few different versions of Final Fantasy IV. I originally played the PS1 version via Final Fantasy Chronicles quite a bit as a kid, but I didn't beat it until I was about 14 or 15 years old. I remember this because shortly after I finished the game, they announced a remake of it on the DS, and I remember being very excited for it. So I bought and played it when it originally released, and I loved that version of Final Fantasy IV. It's a particularly contentious remake though. A lot of people didn't like it because of the augment system, which are basically just items that can be equipped to your characters to give them new abilities. And while I personally felt it really made the game more fun, especially towards the end as you get to have much further customization of your characters, which is namely one of the problems with the gameplay of Final Fantasy IV, I do understand the criticism. Without a guide or walkthrough, the player will often miss a lot of the augments that almost feel essential towards the end of the game. And maybe I just sucked at video games back then, but I remember having a hard time with the final boss in that version with all of the best augments. It also doesn't help that on one of my attempts, my DS crashed right in the middle of the final boss, which was the first and only time I ever experienced my DS crash. Then the time after that, I remember I had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the fight, so out of habit, before I closed my DS to put it into sleep mode, I hit the power button prior. So yeah, that fight took more attempts than it probably should have, but I still lost legitimately 2 or 3 times even still. A few years later, Square Enix remade Final Fantasy IV again as a 2D version that included all of the content from the sequel, After Years story as well for the PSP. Did I play that version? No. Simply because I felt I had gotten my fill of Final Fantasy IV, having played it twice already, and only a couple of years prior. And for the record, they released a GBA version of Final Fantasy IV only a few years prior to the DS release, so Square Enix was on a more committed schedule to remake Final Fantasy IV than making new Final Fantasy games at the time. But anyways, the other reason that Final Fantasy IV on the DS was a great remake was also for story reasons. Not only did we get some fully animated cutscenes with voice acting, which were really well done by the way, but they added backstory to Golbez and how he came to abandon Cecil as a child. They actually tried to explain how he developed this darkness that made him susceptible to Zemus's control, and you at least get to see a bit of Cecil's mother and father. But even this 3D remake of Final Fantasy IV doesn't give us as much backstory as they could have. I actually think that a full reimagining of Final Fantasy IV, similar to Final Fantasy VII, has tremendous potential. There's a whole history that is completely brushed over regarding Cecil's father, Kluya. Supposedly his father invented the Lunar Whale, which, by the way, is like the coolest airship in all of Final Fantasy history. Like, look at this fucking thing. Isn't it just badass? Anyway, it would be really interesting to delve deeper into the lore of the Lunarians, as well as his father Kluya, and how he came to fall in love with a human from Earth. Come to think of it, I wonder if they expanded upon this in the sequel, The After Years. I've never played it. I guess that's a reason you should hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on my coverage of it when I get to it as part of this series. But that's not all. I mean, you could do a whole prequel of a sort exploring how Cecil grew up in the Kingdom of Baron and how he came to be a Dark Knight. It almost seems as if he has darkness inside him as well, so it would make sense that he could be mind controlled at times as well. I already mentioned the bomb ring could be an interesting concept as a sort of weaponized, pre-programmed magic spell or summon of a sort that the Kingdom of Baron could exploit. We never get to visit Damcyan before it's destroyed, or really witness the story of how Edward and Anna meet. We don't get to experience the trials and tribulations of how Rydia survived the Land of Summons. There's a whole character that has a telescope and studies the two moons. Why isn't he part of the main story? And what's up with Golbez's hand? So he can just make his hand float and grab shit? I think we need some lore that explains this ability. In other words, there's tremendous potential for a complete remake of Final Fantasy IV. So there's a million versions of Final Fantasy IV. Which one is the best? Well, of the versions that I've played, I would say that the 3D remake is still the best. This pixel remaster was nicely polished and stays very true to the original game, but I really feel that the little bit of backstory we got with Golbez helped, but even more so are just the enhanced cutscenes. Take this scene in the beginning between Cecil and Rosa. Just being able to peek through Cecil's window and see the two moons in the background not only sets the scene very nicely, but really sets the game's story up by alluding to the cosmos, which is foreshadowing what will come later. Or how about something as small as Rydia expressing heartfelt sympathy towards Cecil as he learns Golbez is his brother. Or even that Golbez's appearance feels more menacing, and some of the lines are just more impactful with the way they're shot than just reading a simple line of text.
Farewell, Cecil.
These scenes really do convey more depth to the characters that pure text and simple movement on screen just doesn't. But overall, does Final Fantasy IV hold up in its own right? Well, the story was impressive for the time, and I think on a first playthrough, it's probably still great as you don't know how many twists and turns there's going to be. Many people criticize Final Fantasy IV for using character deaths as a cop-out, even though the only character that actually dies is Tella. The rest end up living at the end, but I know what they mean. If you don't know what's coming, I think I would still be eagerly anticipating the story as the events unfold, even to this day. However, when you've already beaten the game twice, and played through the beginning several times as I did when I was a kid, and even got about as far as the underworld, it's hard to be shocked when Palom and Porom turn themselves to stone to save the party from an impending wall closing in on them, or Cid sacrificing himself to bomb the enemy, or Kain betraying the party, or Rydia coming to save the day as a grown woman, or teenager? I don't know. All of these moments are memorable moments, but it's hard to find them shocking after playing the game a number of times, as there isn't much dialogue and depth to these scenes beyond the surface, or at least compared to most modern games. Unfortunately, like any great game, you can only play it for the first time once. By today's standards, I don't think there's enough depth to leave a huge lasting impression for new players, but I do think it's still enjoyable, especially given the short length, since most modern versions don't require grinding like the original game did. I mean, hell, I platinumed the game in only about 23 hours or so the game never overstays its welcome, and it's paced particularly well. And I was surprised as to how much fun I had with the gameplay. The ATB system still holds up quite well after all these years. The only problem I had is that they don't show the action cue bar, like when you cast a magic spell or use an ability. There is in fact a waiting period that varies upon what type of ability you use. This is shown in the 3D version though. They also really needed to add more help text to these pixel remaster games. Like, no, I don't remember what the hell Cry does, so it would be nice if I didn't have to pull out my phone to Google search it. So that's yet another reason that I preferred the 3D version of the game. So I'm very much looking forward to playing Final Fantasy V Pixel Remaster, as I've only beaten Final Fantasy V once on the Game Boy Advance, and don't have quite as much of a working memory of the individual parts of the game. But before I play Final Fantasy V, there's actually another spin-off title I have to cover first, and that's Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. You'll have to join me next time to see my coverage of that game. But in the meantime, you might want to check out my video on a different spin-off title, and that's Adventures of Mana, or also originally known as Final Fantasy Adventure. And you can watch that video right here.